Hello, my name is Opal Hope Bennett, Shorts Programmer and Director of Filmmaker Development at Doc NYC. I want to thank you for taking the time to watch this program of shorts, and it's my pleasure to introduce the filmmakers behind the shorts who are here to answer a few questions. It's a great pleasure to have all of them with us. So I'm just going to go around and have everybody introduce yourselves and your film, please. So let's start with you, Geeta.
Sure. Hi, my name is Geeta Gandbhir, and I am a Brooklyn, New York-based filmmaker, and my film is Call Center Blues.
And Anders?
My name is Anders Hammer. I directed and filmed Do Not Split, which is about protests in Hong Kong.
My name is Skye Fitzgerald. I'm based in Portland, Oregon, and I directed Hunger Ward.
Brilliant. Welcome to all of you. Before I launch into questions, can you guys each share with us how you came about your subjects? We'll go in reverse and start with you, Skye.
Yeah, so Hunger Ward is a short doc filmed behind the front lines in Yemen. And I learned through some New York Times photographer friends of the work of just two incredible women doing really difficult work behind the front lines of this really dangerous conflict. And as an ally, I really wanted to showcase their work and their bravery, which goes mostly unheralded, despite how critical it is to saving the lives of so many children. So I was inspired by the work of colleagues in the journalism field.
Brilliant. And Anders?
When the big protests broke out in Hong Kong last summer, I went first, actually out of curiosity, because I was very curious how a group of very young people could take on one of the most powerful countries in the world, which is China. And I wanted to see how it played out in the streets. So I went, I've been working abroad in, let's say, difficult areas for a long time. I lived in Afghanistan for 7 years, and I worked in Iraq and Syria with different documentary projects. I was not sure if I would actually make a documentary in Hong Kong, but I wanted to see if it was possible. And when I arrived there in the summer, I went out in the big protests in the streets, and I started to think about how I could try to capture what was going on as close as possible, because it was really a feeling of, at that time, hope, but also desperation. So I was thinking about how to film it, and I wanted to try, and then it sort of developed through getting to know the protesters. And as you could see in the movie, I was following different people for quite a while, as close as possible as the situation was escalating.
And Geeta?
Sure. So my film is about an unlikely community of deportees from the US that are living in Tijuana, Mexico. I think for me, I had read an article, and the way that I came to the story was I'd read an article in the New York Times about all the call centers that were springing up sort of opportunistically in Tijuana, again, English-speaking call centers that were recruiting all the deportees that had, that had ended up in that city based on US deportation policies. And in 2019, I believe the number was about 267,000 people were deported from the US. And so over the last, it's been a lot, there's been a lot of attention in the media here in the US about deportation policies and ICE and et cetera, which have been incredibly harsh, you know, including there's been the separation of families at the border, you know, a lot of that has caught attention. But what the part of it that I was really interested in is what happens to folks, you know, once they're on the other side, and, you know, what do they do to survive, and how do they come together or not? And so my film is about this really unlikely community of folks working in the call centers down there who are US, you know, deportees, and, you know, their sort of struggle between their displacement and, you know, their longing for home. So that's what the film's about.
Yeah, please stay with me, Geeta, because I love how you detail your entry point into this story. I remember the first time that I saw it thinking, this is the sort of story that's like, kind of hidden right in front of your face, you know? And I mean, I imagine certain of us in the US may have interacted on the other end of a CSR call with these individuals. Um, the film is so rich in terms of the amount of characters' perspectives that you bring and the story arcs of each. And I was curious as to whether that was always your planned approach, or if you had at one point thought about, like, the one character who builds another life, and has a wife, like perhaps focusing it on one subject.
I think that there was a time I always wanted to have a cast of characters because I felt, or participants, as we like to say, because I think the folks who are, deported are not obviously a monolith. There's so many different reasons. And what was really interesting, at one of the hardest things to find, or as far as folks to find, was a female participant, because women are the women that we tried to get to participate in the film were much less willing. I think there's the numbers of men who are deported is higher than women who are deported. But what's interesting is, for women, they carry a lot more fear and shame around their deportation than the men do, and in some ways are a lot more vulnerable. So we ended up with a sort of interesting twist in that story, where we ended up with a young couple, two women who essentially who, even though they themselves were not deported, moved to Tijuana because of the deportation of one of their parents. And so that story, interestingly, kind of gave us the perspective of the ripple effects that, when one person from a family is deported, it is not just that one person and then, life kind of goes on. The entire family is affected. And this young woman, she was rendered homeless by her mother leaving, because her mother was deported, not leaving, her forced, I should say, her forced migration. So the idea of again, what it does, deportation does, not just to an individual, but to the family and the community, made it seem really important to have, again, multiple perspectives.
Yeah, that makes me think of actually the the penal state that we have here in the States, and the fact that the widespread incarceration of individuals has ripple effects.
That's right.
Anders, I'd like to go to you. Your film, I've seen so many on the resistance in Hong Kong, and yours is definitely outstanding in terms of the access that you were able to achieve in this film. I feel like, you almost want to tell the audience to bring a helmet when they watch it. There are so many sequences that you're like, oh my gosh, like we're right in it. Can you please speak to how you were able to achieve such access and be so embedded with these protesters?
I think the short answer is by staying in the streets, because I spent very long time there, and it was so unpredictable, the months during the big protests. So my way to solve it was basically just to stay outside. And then I got to know people better and better, and many of the people that you see in the movie are also met in the situations. So I think you could sometimes feel that it's quite a lot of nerve, and they are quite close to police or other problems in the situation. So, and in that sense, I think maybe it's easier in terms of access, that you show that you're actually so willing to follow all the way, and because sometimes we ended up being trapped when I was following the protesters. So I was following their escape. Now, it was basically by staying with some of the same people for a very long time. Other people I just met in these quite difficult situations that you could see in the movie. But I was very happy to be there and try to capture what was going on. It felt, it was a very intense feeling being there, and they felt that they were fighting for the future. These were students and also younger people going to high school. Some very, very young people. So it's this extreme intensity and will to make a change. At the same time, they were confronted by the police, which became harder and harder in their methods. They used more tear gas, more rubber bullets, and other kinds of bullets. And it was definitely a feeling of a situation getting worse in terms of violence during these months. It was really escalating for a long time. And even though they were very, very tired, they continued taking on to the streets, sometimes or quite often very messy. Because I think you might get the sense of that in the movie as well. So you have a lot of planning on social media apps, or you will have people, demonstrators raising their hands in the streets, making decisions there and then. And so it was, no one knew what would happen in those days, and I think maybe you will see it as well. And it felt so important to the protesters who were taking part. And for me, it was also sad because I saw a lot of people got injured, and you could also really feel their desperation, as you could sort of feel that the government and the police force were closing in on them and trying to crush every effort to make
all
protest.
the efforts. Absolutely. And that leads me to my next question, because I mean, there was certainly footage where we witness dangerous interactions, and I know that you have a background in reportage and or filmmaking in difficult circumstances. I imagine that came into play when you were remaining through those moments where people were being hurt.
Yeah, for me personally, I was okay. I actually broke my nose at some point, but that was it was still like that. I could have seen that coming. It was a risk of it, but I was fine during the period. I think I had training, I had security training through this network. There's an American network called RISK for freelance reporters working in conflict areas, and that was been very helpful. So I know first aid, and I know how to try to protect myself while working in the field in other areas. So I don't think it was not very difficult for me personally. I think I was more, of course, I took care of my own security, but I was also conscious about trying to film in a way that would make it possible for people to see. I was trying to keep the camera quite stable.
Yeah.
And I also faced another risk than many other people I was surrounded by. So I think you can't really compare that situation. So for me, it was okay. It was very physical, and it felt also so physical to be there. It's a very it was so out in the front, the way that the protested was sort of running in desperations with umbrellas and other homemade things, trying to fight against a very well-equipped police. So I think that that's a challenge to tell it in a story that makes sense, and also to focus on the political issues at
Right.
play.
Right. All right, Skye, we're moving over to you to talk about Dr. Ida and Nurse Mekia. You are capturing moments in following their work that were also, fairly difficult times. I remember the sequence with the family that, that lost the baby to starvation, and the very stark response to the grandmother. And I feel like in telling stories like these, it's important to show, the very difficult moments that go on. It's helpful to conveying the story, but I'm curious about one, um, gaining that permission, I guess, because I don't know how much you were able to actually interact with the patients, and then also, how you're able to, um, edit those moments with delicacy. Basically, I think you did a strong job here, but I remember having those thoughts, thinking in that sequence in particular, because it's such a difficult depiction.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Thank you for that. It was hard to film and hard to edit, and uh, we were honored to be able to sort of be with those families and those healthcare workers for so long. The thesis question that I went into the project with was really, how how is it that a young child in 2020 can literally die of starvation, because that's what's happening in Yemen right now. And that was the question we're trying to answer. And I knew um, it wasn't something I could turn away from until I sort of had an answer to that. And I knew that there was a famine in Yemen, and I knew that we as Americans were complicit in some form or fashion, but I didn't know the extent of it. Um, and I didn't know that our tax dollars were going to fund a human cause famine. And so that really was the motivation for me for the project. In terms of access, um, it was very careful, and we did a lot of due diligence beforehand with colleagues at both facilities. So I was working with Mekia and Dr. Ada many, many months before we actually entered their facility for the first time to work out access issues, right? And talk about what they wanted us to do, as well as what we wanted to do. And the reality is that they're doing such difficult work with so few resources that they want um, their stories to be told. And yet the local filmmakers and the local journalists in their communities are in such danger. Adel Hassani, one of my colleagues in Yemen, is in prison right now for doing a story that the local authorities didn't want told. Nabil Akwati, another Yemeni colleague, was shot outside of his home in June for telling a story the local authorities didn't want. So there's a very real danger to telling any story that might have political consequences. And so we worked very carefully with our colleagues, but they wanted to be very quiet and in the background so as to minimize their danger, frankly. And so we started with Aida and Mekia, and had long conversations with them about what they wanted us to document. And that was our starting point. And then we just really spent time with them in their facilities for many, many weeks to just document their work, quite frankly. And our access was always, each of the two physicians we're working with would talk with each family that was admitted to the ward to have long discussions about why we were there, what we were trying to do, and then they would either, after that long conversation, say they wanted to participate or they didn't. And so the families that we ended up covering were all families that wanted to participate. And it was, it's hard to watch a child die in front of you, but it's harder to watch the family react to that. So we had conversations with the families afterwards as well, just to sort of continue that dialogue to make sure that they were okay with what we were doing. But it was a multi-layered process over a long period of time.
Right, right. And briefly, I need to have you speak to this because you've been doing such powerful work out of this, covering this area, 50 feet from Syria, Lifeboat, and now with Hunger Ward between Syria and Yemen. You've been really shining a light on important stories there. And you mentioned being an ally. Please speak to us about why it's important to you to be covering stories there.
So some of I think the most important work that's happening in conflict zones is really being done unheralded, right? By brave people like Dr. Aida. You know, I had a WhatsApp conversation with her yesterday, and since the time that we spent a month in her facility, you know, the funding for the World Food Program that sort of props up the 50% of remaining Yemeni hospitals that are still functional has been diminished by like 70%. And so doctors are not getting their salaries, right? Doctors don't have the right supplies. Why? In part because our tax dollars are funding a bombing campaign, right? That's causing a famine in the country. So, you know, I want to serve as, in part, an ally and a vehicle to help these really heroic individuals, I think, who are doing such important work selflessly. And so that's the motivation. And I think that will always be the motivation for me.
Well, I salute you for that, and thank you for this work. Really, really briefly, I'm getting the wrap message, but I have been doing this with all of our shorts programs since we're unable to have the audience and you interact in person. Please share with us what you want audience members to take away from viewing your films. And we'll start with you, Geeta.
Sure. So I think, I mean, I'm really excited, obviously, to be in this company. And I think all of these films, you know, I feel like, and I can only speak for myself, but I think the, you know, idea that of all these films is sort of to shine a light on or to help uplift voices that already exist, and to maybe use a platform, access to a platform that we might have. So for me, I think, you know, the question, you know, the issue of deportation in this country has been one that has been haunting us for many, many years. The question of who belongs here and who doesn't, right? And, you know, the plight of folks who are undocumented. And I think for me, I really wanted people to be able to, again, which is the hope of, I think, most documentary filmmakers, to walk inside the shoes of folks who have both, who lived in this country from an incredibly young age, and then, you know, lost that and lost the only place they know is home, and to really know what displacement feels like. And these folks do not see themselves obviously as victims. They see themselves as, you know, ultimately they see themselves as sort of survivors of a system that has been unjust to them. But I think as we look towards policy in the future and what policy will be, I mean, we just had an election, so hopefully there's room for change within our, you know, our policies, but just the idea of, you know, borders and migration, you know, I'd love for us to think deeply about these issues and really consider, you know, where we stand on them, and the idea of, you know, what is home and belonging, and, you know, who gets to decide who belongs and who doesn't.
Absolutely. And Skye?
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, You know, David Miliband, the head of the International Rescue Committee, wrote something that has real resonance with me. He wrote, aid agencies can stop the dying, but politics have to stop the killing. And that's really stuck with me. The IRC is very active in Yemen, both politically as well as from a humanitarian standpoint. But that is real resonance to me, because I think, you know, it's enough that a child can die of starvation in modern times. But again, to know that we as American citizens are complicit is something that personally I can't turn away from, and I hope none of us will. And so, you know, I hope we can look and see and ensure that as Americans, we don't continue our current complicity in the starvation of Yemeni children. And to echo Geeta, I hope that with the new administration that we can alter that course fairly rapidly.
Thank you. And Anders, you get the last word.
Yeah, none of the political issues we saw they were fighting for in Do Not Split are solved. It's still a very difficult situation in Hong Kong, more difficult than any time in the last 20 years, I would say. But it's come in the shadow of a lot of other global issues. But it's definitely a very dramatic development we have there now with the human rights situation, and the people are getting a harder time trying to fight for their basic democratic rights. So if this movie could contribute to put spotlight back on Hong Kong and make people interested in reading more about what's happening there and trying to get in touch with organizations and the people, human rights workers and the protesters who are still fighting for the rights there, I would be happy to have made a contribution with our movie. And then there's a lot of information that can be found. It's of course difficult to go anywhere these days, but you can, there's still a lot of good information coming out of Hong Kong, both from local reporters and from human rights activists, and you will easily find it if you go online. So I would
encourage folks to look for themselves.
yeah.
I thank you, Anders and Skye and Geeta. Thank you so much for being here with us and for your brilliant work and for your activism through your work. We salute you, and we got to say bye for now. So bye.